very much. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I thank Dr. Rob Havers and Kelly Hancock of the American Civil War Museum for the invitation to speak in the year of U.S. Grant's 200th birthday. And I'm especially pleased to be with an audience who is appreciative and interested in Grant's history and memory, as well as the Civil War history and memory. My talk addresses the ups and downs of Ulysses S. Grant's historical reputation as a general, a two-term president, and as a private citizen. Grant went, as I said, up and down, up and down. Now it's kind of down again from going up. I'm going to give you the story in my lecture. I'm going to give you a review of Grant's life and career, and I'm going to look at his historical reputation from the lost cause to the soldier statesman. But before that, I do want to speak of the recent upswing. There are cons, though, that have emerged recently, and if you don't know them, you should know them. U.S. Grant has been damaged, his reputation, as with other great historical figures, have come under intense criticism. Monuments are torn down. Historical heroes are being judged and found wanting by current standards. So there are some cons that have reappeared, I would say, in Grant's reputation, and one is that he's been accused of being anti-Semitic, and he has also been accused of being a slaveholder. Now, let me just briefly go through that. In 2017, New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio was challenged by a reporter as to why Grant's tomb still existed in the city when General Grant expelled the Jews as a class, that's quote unquote, in general orders, in his infamous General Orders number 11, issued on December 17, 1862, expelling Jews in a small area of Kentucky. He was concerned with merchants who were trading with the enemy, but those merchants happened to be Jews, and he extended it to Jews as a class. Lincoln immediately demanded it be rescinded. He publicly apologized. As president, he appointed more Jews to public office than any before him, and he was the first president to attend a dedication to a new synagogue. He also spoke out against Jewish persecution in Europe when he was president. Can we forgive him that massive mistake? Well, Americans at the time did, but it's different these days. There's another issue that has come up and has tarnished his reputation, and that is Grant, the slave owner. And here's the deal with that. He lived at a place called Whitehaven in Mississippi when he resigned from the army in the 1840s, and he lived in this place. He worked very hard as on a farm that his father-in-law owned, and he worked side by side with his father-in-law's enslaved people, and also his father-in-law gave him a slave and for his personal use. Now this information did not surface until quite recently, when a document appeared in 1859 when that shows that Grant legally emancipated this slave named William Jones. And we don't know all the details about it. Grant has no record before the Civil War as being anti-slavery. But I think, as you will see, that we might bring some context to our understanding of all historical figures, and perhaps we can do that with U.S. Grant as as I hope to convince you that you will run and tear down his statue, the next one you see. In any case, I want to provide you, obviously, with some food for thought regarding the current state of evaluating prominent figures of the past. This is a coin that was minted during Grant's high point as a general, father, savior, defender. So you see before you the profiles of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and then Grant, giving you an idea of how he was thought of. From 1862 to 1865, he was probably the most famous general of the war in those years. His position as general-in-chief plunged him into the struggles between President Andrew Johnson and the Republican Congress. In 1868, he accepted the Republican nomination for president with his campaign slogan, "Let us have peace." If only judged by his first term, his presidency might have been called a grand success. What you see is a picture of him in his presidential outfit. For his strong support in enabling the passage of the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote. This is just in his first term. For his generous amnesty to Confederates with the Amnesty Act of 1872, for presiding over a surging, albeit unstable economy, for his reform program for Native Americans, and for his peaceful settlement of grievances with England, culminating in the Treaty of Washington. There were missteps, of course, along the way. He had a weakness for his friends that, in other words, he was loyal to a fault, leading to a number of scandals for which he is best known, I guess, i.e. the whiskey ring. But he learned along the way. In 1872, he swept the Democratic ticket with a huge mandate from the electorate. Few second terms go well for presidents. I can send you that in a text if you want, but it's true. Hailed by millions, and when I say millions, I mean millions and millions of people across Europe, India, China, and Japan. They hailed him as a military leader and a hero and an emerging, the leader of an emerging democratic global power. When he came back, he retired to New York City, and he lost his entire savings in a financial scandal. He was never good with money from the beginning of his life to the end, and he was reduced to poverty. To earn money, he agreed to write about his wartime experiences for Century Magazine's spectacularly successful Battles and Leaders series, an interesting and important series of books. Grant's contributions proved so popular that he decided to write his military memoirs just as he was diagnosed with a fatal throat cancer. Before his death in 1885, Grant completed the writing of his autobiography, which brought renewed reverence from many citizens. Imbued with a spirit of reconciliation between the sections, the personal memoirs is considered one of the greatest autobiographies of the English language, earning classic status both as literature and history. At his death, he was the most famous of all Americans, both at home and abroad. More than 1 million people watched his funeral procession in New York City on August 8, 1885. There you see it. I've just come from California, where I watched hours of the Queen's funeral. Nothing to Grant's funeral, I assure you. America remained New York City's most popular tourist site until 1929. Also, massive monuments to Grant in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Boston, and in national military parks in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Virginia. As important as Grant's legacy is to the making of modern America, this is a poster of his presidential run with Schuyler Colfax. Later, his second term, he had Henry Wilson as his vice president. In any case, as important as Grant's legacy was to the making of modern America, as important as and appreciated as his military career would continue to be in the minds of many, a constant drumbeat of criticism diminished his reputation. Fire came from both adherence to the lost cause, which elevated the Confederacy, the cause of the war with states' rights. The Confederacy lost because it was overwhelmed by numbers, but at the same time, it diminished the Union Army's achievements, and particularly Grant, who was compared very unfavorably to Robert E. Lee. It also came from disaffected Republicans like Charles Sumner and intellectual Henry Adams, who contributed too much to Grant's stereotype as a butcher general who only won because his army vastly outnumbered the enemy, an out-of-control drunk, and an incompetent president. When I did research on the memory and history of Grant through the after the Civil War through the 19th and into the 20th, how close the criticisms were from both Northern and Southern people. The two architects of the lost cause were Edward Pollard, a journalist, and Jubal Early, to glorifying Confederate defeat. Indeed, Reconstruction's unpopularity in both North and South added fuel to the bonfire, diminishing his reputation, and shaped the low esteem in which his administration has been held, certainly in the popular, but also in the scholarly world. In the early decades of the 20th century, understanding and knowledge of Grant's contribution to preserving the Union continued its steady decline against a growing mythic appeal of white Southern nobility and romanticism, depicted so vividly in the novel and movie Gone with the Wind. His reputation in history books and progressive historians' history book, for example, the Dunning School at Columbia, was similarly low. The history books and many monographs published in the 1930s, 20s, 30s, and 40s mocked him, denigrated, or ignored him. If you visited Grant's tomb in the 1930s, you would find very few visitors and signs of gross deterioration, which I found on my first trip to Grant's tomb in 1979. I was in Muir Lass. In the early, so that's I'm giving you a sense of his reputation and how it was so low. A great disappointment to me, because I'm an admirer of Winston Churchill, was his comments on Grant in his A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, his textbook, in which he wrote of Grant's, quote, unflinching butchery, and Churchill concluded that his generalship, quote, must be regarded as the negation of generalship because of that butchery. Now, I'm painting this dire picture. Not every historian agreed. Military historians such as J.C.F. Fuller, Lloyd Lewis, T. Harry Williams, and Bruce Catton, who's one of the great historians of the Civil War, provided very fair and even really incisive appreciations of Grant. But it had to go up, right? It had to go up because it had nowhere to go but up. And beginning in the 1990s, I would say, you started to see historians take a second look at Grant, even as, for my sins, one of the things I did was look at representations of Grant on TV shows. So you didn't have to do it. I've done it for you. I watched The Family Guy, Beverly Hillbillies, and episodes where, and he's always portrayed in the same way, an out-of-control drunk who tries to surrender the Union Army to Robert E. Lee. That's about it. I know. But where we're going now is Grant in a time of revision, and we're looking at him as a soldier statesman, which this illustration, the modern Gulliver among the Lilliputians, sort of brought it back to that. And the conventional accounts of Grant's generalship and presidency no longer square with what came before. So that's what I want to get to now. In the war, in his wartime history, a new generation of writers and scholars began to stress that it was Ulysses S. Grant's conviction and belief in eventual Union victory is what guided his policy, his thoughts, his passion during the war. Historians such as Brooks Simpson, H.W. Brand, Sean Wilentz highlighted Grant's resolute nature. In fact, resolute is a word that was applied to him in a flattering way during his career, and certainly historians have picked up on that. It manifests in Grant's willingness to wage war with a remorseless ferocity in the cause of saving the Union, but at the same time realized that the ultimate goal was reunion. And so he demonstrated magnanimity toward the enemy at various points. In doing so, as Ronald White and Ronald Chernow's new massive biographies, or newer massive biographies have shown, he developed a broad national perspective on the means as well as the ends of rebellion. That's what made him such an important figure for Lincoln, because there wasn't anyone else like Grant at his height in the military that he could trust. As general, Grant not only planned and executed military campaigns, but also presided over the occupation of the southern population and territory. He formulated and implemented policies and practices that not only predicted Reconstruction, but actually was wartime Reconstruction. And what do I mean by that? For example, when he was in Tennessee, when he was in Mississippi, part of his task was not only planning campaigns and then executing them, but also dealing with the civilian population. What should the occupation be? How can we get them to swear loyalty oaths so we can get the economy up and running again? Also, what about the formerly enslaved people? What do we do with them? It was a gigantic social experiment that was happening in the middle of this terrible war. So his task was to combine policies of reconciliation, defining freedom for formerly enslaved people, while presiding over the process of white citizens taking loyalty oath. This experience, it prepared him for the office of the president. He consulted with the highest political officials of the United States over these issues on a constant basis, with not only Abraham Lincoln, but Edwin Stanton, and was acutely aware of the political nature of the war and prepared him as no other for the problems and challenges that lay ahead. And it always makes me smile when so many portray Grant as naive about politics. There's nothing more fierce than politics in the military. It's true that he wasn't ready for the politics of Congress. He had to learn that, and I think he did. After the war was over, Grant remained a powerful presence, officially serving as a general-in-chief, overseeing the military part of Reconstruction policy for President Andrew Johnson, and had an investment on his behalf, but the behalf of the soldiers who fought in the war, to help establish a permanent and solid peace between North and South. His political bent was further burnished with the events between 1865 and 1868, in which Grant, again, became invested in the political process in order to save the Union that was won in the war from being lost in the peace. As commanding general of the Army, he directed military policy for the post-war South, making decisions and taking actions that brought him into an unfolding political crisis in the Johnson administration. He was Johnson's Secretary of War for 5 months. Grant was demonstrating to the country his understanding that the issue of the Civil War would continue to impact the public policy of the country for years to come. That it's not really the end of the war. So it's quite a complicated situation. The revisionists that drove the upward trend of Grant's reputation stressed the enormity of his undertaking in 1868, roiled by Civil War assassination, a $2 billion war debt, impeachment trials, and constant turmoil over the Southern question. Voters elected General Grant to clean up the disastrous mess, it must be said, created by, in part, the nation's political class. A majority of Americans couldn't have cared less about Grant's early fumbling with cabinet selection. Yes, he didn't know what he was doing in the first few months, as many presidents don't, or his friendship with wealthy supporters, which was attacked, or his supposed lack of cultural polish that so offended Senator Charles Sumner and others. A majority approved of him. They approved of his first term achievements as I listed. They felt it was stable. He had wise people in his cabinet, such as Hamilton Fish, a superb Secretary of State. He was reelected by a landslide in 1872. As I already said, his second term was marred. Well, in the new literature that's come out, historians have singled out 2 things about Grant as president. Grant's record, enabling him perhaps to get the label of a civil rights hero, and Grant's record as a nationalist and a reconciliationist. They sound, and they probably were, a little bit contradictory, but here we go. What is the case to be made for Grant as a civil rights president? The 18th president is hailed as the early champion of Black civil rights. He strongly supported the 14th and 15th Amendment as a candidate. As president, he was faced with implementing the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. He had to restore the rights and privileges of the citizenship of Southern whites, but also protect the rights and establish the citizenship of Southern Blacks. Among many other actions, he proudly signed off on the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. He broke the spine of the KKK in 1872, and he tried as president through his 8 years to stop the violent chaos that attended Black voting in the South. Grant repeatedly denounced the racism and bigotry that animated opposition to Reconstruction policies. Here's what he said, and if you ever read, he has blessedly short inaugural addresses, as they did in those days, but he really says some amazing things in them. And here's one that he said in his second inaugural address, quote, "The effects of the late civil strife has been to free the slave and make him a citizen. Yet he is not possessed of the civil rights which citizenship should carry with it. This is wrong and should be corrected." He made strides in appointing African Americans and Jews and Native Americans to federal positions. He publicly welcomed Black delegations, appeared and spoke at Black conventions, and I think that the revisions have come out. They're coming out. A recent, very fine volume on Grant's presidency was published by Charles Calhoun. It's called entitled The Presidency of U.S. Grant. It's actually the first modern work to provide a balanced, nuanced portrayal of his 8 years in office. Calhoun and the others that I've mentioned before have laid the foundation of academic scholarship that has reshaped the understanding of Reconstruction. They recognize that Grant operated amid intensely racist forces in both North and South that really made it hard to sustain the reforms to assist African Americans. And the only way that that would have happened, to be honest, is if the United States Army occupied the South, but that wasn't going to happen. In short, the two goals of the war collided, and President Grant could not go against the voters' sentiments because in state after state in the North went against the Republicans' Reconstruction policies. And a especially important state was Ohio. Election coming up, he withdrew the troops from the South for the most part. And I will say that he actually lost power in the congressional elections of 1874 when the Democrats took Congress for the first time since before the Civil War. So he had no leverage there. Grant always felt that he was following in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln. He venerated Abraham Lincoln. And the 3 acts that were passed by a Republican Congress in 1862, the most important acts, I think, and are among the most important acts of our history legislation, the Transcontinental Railroad Act, the Morrill Act for Education, and the Homestead Act was fulfilled or begun to be fulfilled by Grant's administration. And it was to the West that the dream of unity, national unity, was attempted, and I think probably more successful than anywhere else. I don't, and I won't continue this lecture very much longer, although I could talk for hours. It is my inaugural lecture. But here's the thing. This military hero became a skilled politician and a stalwart performer and a stalwart Republican. He lobbied for his agenda. He actually twisted arms, wielded patronage. He promoted policies, and he shrewdly enlisted supporters in Congress. So he was not the idiot that he has been portrayed by in so many books as president. And I think that he emerged as a nationalist above all. Throughout the presidency, Grant remained absolutely steadfast in the belief that the Union was worthy of being preserved. Like Lincoln, his fight was over the future of the Union, only this time the issues were not secession and slavery, but what kind of nation, admittedly imperfect, would emerge at the dawn of the 20th century. Thank you.